I didn't take the brass rook seriously when the old man pressed it into my palm. It was cool and weighty like a coin from a country that no longer existed, its base scratched with a string of numbers that looked like coordinates. "For when the board tilts against you," he said, closing my fingers around the chess piece with surprising strength. His white hair whipped in the river breeze, his eyes alert and ferociously alive. We'd met 10 minutes earlier because his grocery sack split open on the walkway outside Pier 14, and apples rolled toward the water like runaway planets. I chased them, one by one, and he nodded in a way that felt like the end of a match only he had been playing. That night, I left the rook on my kitchen counter beside a lukewarm mug of chamomile and a stack of printouts stamped Halcyon Maritime, my employer, my second home, the scaffolding I'd built my hopes on. I'd come to New York with 2 suitcases and a laptop older than my apartment's radiator, blown north from Miami after my mother's second stroke left our cupboards thin and our patience thinner. Numbers were how I made sense of a chaotic world. Ship telemetry, cargo manifests, AIS pings, fuel burn curves. These behaved when people didn't. I was good at it. Good enough that Halcyon's analytics division recruited me to help model routes that shaved hours off delivery and millions off budgets. Good enough that I caught the attention of their golden son. Ethan Kincaid never introduced himself like a prince, but everyone else did it for him. The founder's grandson, the board's darling, he wore the company like an evening jacket he could shrug out of whenever it wrinkled. And yet he listened to me in meetings. He asked why my anomaly detector flagged a cluster of tankers near the Azores, why their reported tonnage didn't match their drafts, why our risk map pulsed red where no storm brewed. He laughed at my bad jokes and brought me ginger tea when my voice vanished during the winter flu. For a while, I mistook curiosity for respect and convenience for love. When Ethan kissed me in the stairwell after a quarterly review, my deck flashing on a dozen executive tablets, I let the applause drown out the warning bells. "You always see the hidden currents," he said against my hair. "I want to follow you into them." I answered like a girl who hadn't learned yet that some currents spiral. We married under a glass ceiling that made even January look like a promise. My dress was simple. His family wasn't. They smiled with well-practiced warmth, and the toasts landed like soft threats wrapped in crystal. Ethan's mother, Eleanor, grazed my cheek with a kiss as light as a moth. "Welcome to the blue blood," she whispered, a phrase that made me think of ink bleeding through paper, staining whatever lay beneath. Marriage magnified everything, the tenderness, the pressure, the invisible ledger of debts. Ethan wanted to be better than his surname, but his surname wanted to be everything. At work, small fissures formed. Reports I hadn't written appeared with my signature. Decisions I hadn't made bore my initials. A compliance memo I filed about those Azores tankers, about ghost cargo and falsified weights, vanished from the archive like sea mist. When I brought it up, my manager blinked blankly. "Send it again," he said, as if an email could drown twice. Then came the audit. I remember the conference room's halogen glare, the scent of burnt coffee, the way everyone avoided my eyes as if my pupils had become eclipses. 2 investigators from an external firm leafed through a binder. "Ms. Ortiz, our logs show you accessed sensitive billing ports after hours and exported restricted manifests," the woman said, tapping a page. I stared at the timestamp, 2:17 a.m. The same night I'd been home with a fever, texting Ethan about how the tea tasted like smoke. My badge, my laptop, my credentials, every trace pointed to me. I laughed the way a person laughs when the ground leaves. "You know I didn't do this." "Intent is not the question," the man replied, bland as paperwork. "Custody is." I told Ethan everything that night. He paced our living room, raking his hair back, his jaw clenched. "It's a misunderstanding," he said at last. "I'll fix it." But the next morning my system access was gone. By afternoon I was escorted past the lobby's aquarium, glassy fish sliding through blue light, mouths opening and closing like they were practicing our names. On the sidewalk, a winter-sharp wind cut through my coat. I called Ethan. He didn't pick up. A week later, a lawyer with a watch that ticked louder than his voice slid an agreement across a polished table. "Resign quietly and Halcyon won't pursue damages," he said. "We'll offer a modest severance in light of your contributions." I read the paragraphs 3 times. The phrasing was a maze. But the Minotaur at its center needed no introduction. I would admit to procedural lapses, accept a ban from the industry for 3 years, and avoid any mention of Azores, tankers, anomalies, or ghosts. I would swap truth for silence. "Ethan?" I asked, foolish as a child in a fairy tale. "Does he know?" "He's agreed this is best," the lawyer said, which is not the same as yes. I didn't sign. I went home instead, to our apartment's tight rooms and the quiet phone. I counted the hours since my last paycheck and the days until my mother's next medication refill. I held my abdomen, flat then, a secret hope unwilling to speak, and told myself that storms end if you keep breathing through them. The old man's rook glinted from the counter. I turned it over in my fingers, tracing the coordinates. Somewhere off the Brooklyn waterfront, if I wasn't misreading. It was a ridiculous idea. It was also the only one I had. I found him where the numbers said he'd be, an abandoned ferry slip, long since retired to rust and graffiti, listening to the East River slap its pilings. He stood beneath a tangle of steel, hands tucked into the pockets of his navy coat, eyes on the water as if it were reading a telegram only he could see. "You came sooner than I expected," he said, not surprised at all. "You gave me a chess piece with coordinates scratched into it." He shrugged. "A more polite summons than smoke on the horizon." "Who are you?" I asked. He gave me a look that balanced mischief and grief on a knife edge. "I'm the part of Halcyon that didn't get an obituary," he said. "Elias Hart, co-founder, exile, occasional sore tooth in the mouth of very expensive lawyers." I stared, the name snapping a latch in my memory. Hart and Kincaid, the bronze plaque that used to hang in the lobby before Ethan's grandfather rebranded the company with a fistful of capital and a hunger for legacy. Hart, the engineer who designed the early algorithms that made Halcyon more Oracle than Freightliner. Hart, the rumor. Hart, the ghost. "You vanished," I said, because the world had taught me to repeat headlines. "I got erased," he corrected, then nodded at the rook. "People who pick up falling apples and return them aren't common. People who look under the waterline aren't either. I've been following your work since your paper on AIS spoofing in grad school. You see what's missing. That makes you dangerous to men who appoint themselves the ocean." "Someone framed me," I said, "and they think I'll sign away the right to say it out loud." Elias's smile was small and satisfied, like a lock clicking open. "Then you're useful," he said. "I'm going to ask you a question that will sound like blasphemy if you still believe in the Kincaid gospel." He leaned closer, breath fogging in the cold. "Do you want to wreck a dynasty? Not to watch it burn, but to build what should have stood in its place?" My mouth went dry. Beyond him, the river carried a gull feather past like a tiny white flag surrendering to current. "What do you want from me?" "Proof," he said, "and patience. Halcyon's clean lines hide crooked rooms, tankers that don't carry what their manifests claim, fuel that disappears into hands who don't smell like diesel, insurance claims from ships that never sailed through the storms they swear destroyed them. The Kincaids converted a logistics miracle into a money-laundering cathedral. They forged your badge into the first nail for your coffin because you pointed toward the rot." Anger cracked something that had been frozen inside my chest. "If you know this, why haven't you gone to the authorities?" "I have," he said, mouth twisting. "They sent thank you emails and requests for campaign donations. I've pushed on every door that's supposed to open in a democracy. The hinges whined, the locks held." "So why me?" "Because my hands are the past," Elias said. "Yours are the future, because you still have access I don't. Friendships, Slack threads, backup drives you forgot to wipe. Because you loved a Kincaid, and that betrayal is a furnace. Because—" He hesitated, and for the first time I saw the tremor in his left thumb, the ache in his shoulders when the wind shifted. "Because I'm running out of time, Maya." Hearing my name in his voice softened me against my will. I thought of Ethan's promises and the steel staircase where we once planned a life. I thought of my mother and the way her hand found mine when the pain got mean. I thought of the faint, fierce hope I held, smaller than a heartbeat. Above us, a fairy horn bellowed, deep and certain. I could have walked away. That would have been the safer story. The one where I moved to a smaller city, changed fields, sold my laptop for rent, and learned to breathe around regret. I could have. "How?" I asked. Elias let the river speak for 3 beats before answering. We gather what can't be argued with. Originals, not copies. Logs the Kincaids think they deleted. Side ledgers, not the monthly sanitized exports. Conversations they forgot lived on a cloud they don't own. Then we build an engine to push those truths into the only current stronger than money. He met my eyes. Public scrutiny, shareholder panic, criminal inquiry, not all at once, tide by tide. And when the board looks for a story that lets them keep their yachts and sleep at night, we hand them yours. Mine? I whispered. The woman who saw the rot first and was punished for it. The engineer who can fix the parts that should have never been loosened, not as a martyr, as a successor. I shook my head, dizzy with the altitude of the vision. You're talking about replacing Ethan's family at the helm of Halcyon. I'm talking about setting the ship upright, he said. Names matter less than ballast. Cold air burned my lungs. I closed my fingers around the rook until its edges dug crescents into my skin. Somewhere deep in the city, sirens wailed and then dissolved. If I say yes, I asked, what happens to me? You become who you were built to be, Elias said softly. And men who think the ocean answers to them learn a different lesson. When I finally nodded, he didn't smile. He just exhaled like a diver breaking the surface. Good, he said. We start simple. You go home, you rest, you act normal. Tomorrow you'll receive a package at your door. Tools, not weapons. And a list of names that never appear together. Memorize the names. Burn the list. If anyone asks, you never met me. I tucked the rook into my pocket. As we turned to go, I asked the one last question I'd been afraid to shape. Does Ethan know what his family's done? Elias's eyes went somewhere I couldn't follow. Sons of dynasties are taught not to ask what they benefit from, he said. But sometimes love pries their eyes open. Be prepared for either answer. I walked back through the wind with the chess piece warming against my thigh. In the narrow elevator, the mirror returned a version of me I barely recognized. Shoulders squared, mouth set, eyes clear as winter. On my counter, between the cold tea and the pile of printouts, lay the non-disclosure agreement, still unsigned. I lifted it, struck a match, and fed the first corner to flame. The paper curled like a leaf in drought. Smoke tanged the air, the smell of endings and, if you're stubborn, beginnings. Across the hall, a neighbor's baby cried, and my hand drifted to my abdomen again, protective, certain. For when the board tilts against you, Elias had said, the board had already tilted. My job now was to tip it back until the right king fell. The package arrived at 9:11 a.m., 1 minute after the time Elias had written in the email that vanished as soon as I blinked. No return address. Brown paper, twine, a smear of machine grease on one corner like a fingerprint from a ghost. I signed with hands that looked steadier than I felt and carried it inside, locking the door out of habit, out of superstition, out of everything I was about to become. Inside, a battered field notebook with graph paper pages, a cheap flip phone with the plastic still on the screen, a dongle the size of a knuckle, and an old-fashioned brass key on a red string. Tucked into the notebook's back pocket was a single page, handwritten in block letters, clean enough to belong to a man who had once drawn schematics with rulers. Use the flip. Power on only outside your apartment. Battery out when not in use. Dongle equals cold bridge. Allows read-only mount of shadow backups when plugged between USB plus target. No writes, no traces. Keybox 237, Hudson Storage, MF 8-6, ask for Beth. Names, Priya Das, Infraop S. Benito Cruz, claims, Sparrow, freelance risk. Laura Wexler, journal. First move, recover your missing memo. Location, see notebook PG 3. I turned to page 3. Coordinates again, but these I knew by heart. The address of Halcyon's old satellite office in Red Hook, sold last year to a trendy production company that filmed moody beer commercials. The building's basement had once housed a disaster recovery tape library and a backup rack nobody budgeted to decommission. I joked in a meeting that the rack would outlive us all. The room had no network line, which made removing it as thankless as digging up a giant tree stump. They'd locked the door and called it solved. I memorized the names. I read them aloud once under my breath, then again shaping each syllable into a place to return to in the dark. I lit the stove, touched the edge of the paper to the flame, and watched the fibers blacken and lift as a curling ghost. My smoke alarm remained polite. Maybe it understood necessity. I powered on the flip phone in the stairwell as instructed. No welcome animation, just a blank field and a signal bar that flickered between 1 and 2. There was one text message waiting from a number without a country code. Beth. If asked, it's architectural plans. If not asked, say nothing. I smiled despite myself. Elias did not assume the world would behave. He designed around its indifference. The elevator smelled faintly of boiled cabbage. On the first floor, Mrs. Hahn from 1B was coaxing a stroller through the vestibule. I held the door, and she thanked me with a look that lingered, a mother's intuition reading the extra vigilance in my eyelids. Outside, a wind off the river gnawed the edges of my scarf. I walked until my cheeks stung and my lungs felt scoured, then stopped under the skeletal shade of a leafless maple and dialed the only number in the flip's contacts. A click, no hello. It's Maya, I said. I'm ready. Then start by doing something ordinary, Elias replied. Buy coffee. Miss your train. Let the city make noise over your thoughts. After that, red hook. I followed orders. Not because I needed caffeine, but because obedience to small rituals steadies hands before they start unscrewing the bolts that hold empires together. On the subway, I sat between a man playing chess against himself on a travel board and a girl drawing the same wave over and over in a notebook, each crest higher than the last. When we surfaced on Smith 9th, the sky looked like steel, low and undecided. The production company had hung a vinyl banner over the old halcyon sign, but the letters still bled through in certain light. Ghost ship under fresh paint. The receptionist's name tag said Taya, and her cardigan was the color of apricots. Hi, I said, settling my shoulders into a shape that used to be mine. Architectural plans for the basement retrofit. Beth said to come by. Taya considered me, then called a number from a sticky note taped beside her keyboard. They told me you'd look like you haven't slept, she said, smiling with professional mercy. Beth's down the hall, 4th door. Watch the step. Beth proved to be a woman in her 50s, with a jaw that could hold a line against any storm and hands that knew how to lift more than boxes. She took the brass key, weighed it without comment, and led me past rows of C-stands and light modifiers to a door with an old halcyon numeric sticker, still half adhered. When the lock turned, I felt a little like a diver who'd found the seam in the wreck. The room smelled like dust and cool metal, the close, clean scent of sleeping machines. The backup rack stood against the far wall, a blackened monolith threaded with closed eyes. An orange extension cord snaked toward it from a newer outlet like an IV in a museum. Beth flicked a breaker. 15 minutes, she said. Then whatever was asleep gets cranky. I can cover your noise for 10. Noise. 10 minutes. Read only. No pressure. I knelt, plugged the cold bridge between my laptop and the rack, and waited while the terminal negotiated with a pass that didn't know it was supposed to be over. The drive spun, an insect chorus. The index bloomed like a night-blooming flower. BK Halcyon, compliance 2023-12, quell. There. My memo's file name, the one IT had told me didn't exist. I felt a little sick with recognition, like glimpsing your own face in a crowd at the exact moment you think you've disappeared. I mounted the volume read-only, copied the memo to a fresh, encrypted thumb drive, then began pulling adjacent strata. System logs from the night it vanished, access control deltas, checksum lists that would prove the copy I recovered matched what lived here before the purge. Time, as it does when you need it to slow, sprinted. Beth cleared her throat from the hall at minute 11. Almost, I said, and grabbed one last directory, oddly named, innocuous, UT Cron, because my instincts have never forgiven me when I ignore them. We killed the rack like a mercy. Beth locked the door, returned the key, and pressed a card into my palm. If the men in good coats ask, she said, we never met. If you need 10 more minutes, ask Taya for apricot tea. Thank you, I said, and meant a bigger phrase. Back on the street, Red Hook glinted like a city pretending to be a small town. I ducked into a bakery, bought a bag of pistachio cookies I didn't want, and slipped the thumb drive under its wax paper liner. On the sidewalk, I typed on the flip with my dumbest thumbs, M, fish landed, gills intact, E, good, do not open on home Wi-Fi, use library, floor 3, back table, left of railing, bring cookies. The library was all oak and quiet, and the hum of air vents old enough to remember different wars. I found the table, opened the bag, and pried the drive from beneath its sugared shelter. I didn't look at my memo first, not yet. I opened the system logs. User M. Kincaid initiated Archive Ops cat job. User Eordi my account. A request tagged to my badge while my laptop at home slept under a coat of dust. ACL change. Compliance 2023-12 right group expanded to privileged exec. Delete request. File memo draft Azores anomalies.pdf. Delete overridden retention policy. Delete reissued with superuser token. Delete executed. Shadow copy created per cron job retention. Bucket util. I exhaled like I'd been under too long. My heart did a slow, deliberate turn in my chest. The logs were the story and the corroboration in one. Ethan's username tripped the first domino. A superuser token, no name, just a key at God level, kicked away the second. And the system, bless its stupid honesty, quietly saved a shadow copy to the innocuous cron directory I'd grabbed on instinct. I wanted to laugh and cry and throw up on the oak. I clicked my memo at last. There it was, my voice in black letters, dry and precise, pointing where it shouldn't. Observed AIS manifest mismatch among tankers flagged under Ublia registry, see Appendix B. Estimated realized uplift from declared versus observed draft suggests unreported cargo. Cross-reference with Halcyon route arbitration logs reveals preferential scheduling for vessels with anomalous telemetry. Recommend immediate internal audit plus external notification. Appendix B included a table of MMSI numbers and timestamps, and a little star I'd dropped next to one vessel whose name I'd liked, Calypso, now felt like a punchline told without a smile. The flip buzzed. A new number. Priya. Elias says you eat your vegetables. Good. You'll hate the next dish. Meat. No phones. 7 p.m. Fort Greene Park. Watch the dog walkers. Bring nothing that can be turned against you. Wear ugly shoes. I stared at the message and thought of nights in the old office when Priya and I had engineered our way through impossible deployment windows with bad pizza and better profanity. She'd been the one who made architecture diagrams pretty enough to frame. She'd also been the one to squeeze my shoulder the day I was escorted out, fury blazing naked on her face. If she was still inside, she was a door. At home, my apartment felt smaller, like a throat tightening. I hid the thumb drive in the cavity behind the stove's kickplate and wrote a decoy grocery list in bold letters. Tomatoes, lemons, rice, because sometimes the only safe place for the extraordinary is under something ordinary enough to bore a thief. I powered down the flip, popped the battery, and put both halves on different shelves in the broom closet. Then I called my mother. She sounded better than she had last week. The new meds made her tongue less heavy. "You sound tired," she told me, which is how mothers say I'm scared for you without adding weight. I told her about the cookies, left out everything with teeth, promised to visit Friday with the good empanadas from the shop near the clinic. When we hung up, I stood at the window and watched the angle of the light crawl along the bricks across the alley like a sundial made of other people's days. At 6:52, I crested the hill in Fort Greene and sat on a bench that splintered through my coat. Dog walkers made ellipses around the lawn, tails, neon leashes, a chorus of barks polite and impolite. At 6:59, Priya sat without looking at me, a woman in a navy beanie that read "Nope" in lowercase cursive. "You always hated that bench," I said, "because banalities are a bridge." "I still do," she replied. "How's unemployment?" "Character building," she huffed. "They made me sign a non-disparagement extension last month. New policy. HR said it was for culture. Culture my—" She stopped herself and blew into her hands. "Elias told me to ask you one question before we go any further. Answer wrong and I'll delete your existence from every staging cluster you ever loved." "Ask." "Do you want your job back, or do you want the truth to land even if it breaks what's left of you?" The world compressed to a point so small only a single word could pass. "Truth," I said, and surprised myself with how fast it came. "Good," she said, shoulders relaxing. "Because a job is a room, truth is the building." She slid a crumpled napkin between us. On it, a list of internal nicknames only Halcyon's infra team would know: Greyhound, Lantern, Muppet Show, and a string of IPs. Greyhound is the ops mirror the Kincaids use when they don't want security logging their playtime. It's on a subnet we pretend we can't see. We can. Lantern is the S3 proxy, that accidentally caches direct upload receipts from partner ports for 72 hours. Muppet Show is the Slack export pipeline legal pretends they only run quarterly. She glanced at me, eyes glittering. You didn't get this from me. I was never here. If we're lucky, Greyhound still has connection history from the night they killed your memo. My pulse hopped in my throat. Why help me? Because I like sleeping, Priya said, then softened. Because you looked for the leak when everyone else lit candles and hoped the ship wasn't taking on water. And because I watched Ethan Kincaid sign an access exemption with a pen that looked too expensive for someone who didn't know where the network closet lives. Something like grief passed between us, a whip crack of memory, a picture of a stairwell and a promise. Do you think he knew what he was signing? I think men who are handed swords as toddlers can't tell if they're cutting fruit or throats, she said, not unkindly. You ready to make some rich people nervous? I smiled with half my mouth. I was born nervous. She stood, dusted her hands, and dropped one last line without ceremony. If you want a reporter who doesn't die when cars malfunction, call Lara Wexler. She orders her coffee like a threat and files FOIAs for fun. Don't text. Send her a postcard with a cartoon octopus on it. She'll understand. Priya walked away, a note beanie vanishing into the river of people. I sat a while longer, watching the park shift from gold to blue, letting my body memorize the feeling of being at the exact beginning of a long road. When I finally stood, my phone buzzed, my normal one, the one I wasn't supposed to use for anything that mattered. A message from Ethan blinked on the screen. Can we talk? The 3 words made my stomach flip once, hard. I stared until the screen dimmed, until my reflection returned, ghosted by fingerprints and sky. The city breathed behind me, the rook in my pocket pressed against my thigh, an anchor or a question. I typed a reply I didn't send, erased it, typed another, and finally slipped the phone back into my bag unsent. Some conversations require an ocean between intent and outcome. Some require proof. I had the first pieces of both. The next morning, the city woke me with sirens and frost. I pulled on the ugliest shoes I owned, mud-stained sneakers I'd once used for painting a friend's apartment, and walked to the library again. Elias's rules circled in my head like a catechism. No home Wi-Fi, no traces, always act ordinary. I wasn't ready for ordinary, though. Not after Priya. Not after the message from Ethan still unsent in my phone. So I sat at the same oak table, opened the bakery bag I'd left in my backpack, and chewed through a stale pistachio cookie until my hands stopped trembling. Then I slid the thumb drive into the laptop and opened the directory I'd pulled on instinct. UTL/cron. Inside were not just shadow copies but scripts, scheduled jobs someone had buried deep in Halcyon's infrastructure. Names short enough to pass as harmless, checklog.sesh sweep-dash. But when I opened sweep-dash, my blood iced. The script scanned a list of directories for flagged memos, compliance, audit, risk, and moved them to an off-site bucket before erasing their entries in the main archive. The off-site bucket wasn't Halcyon's server at all. It was a private endpoint, masked under a generic cloud provider, routing traffic to a server farm in Luxembourg. Whoever ran sweep.sh had built themselves a chute. Dump anything dangerous down the tunnel, bury it offshore, and leave no trace in New York. I screenshotted the code, saved it in triplicate, then closed everything so quickly it felt like slamming doors before a thief noticed. Proof. More than proof. A weapon. At 11:07, the flip phone buzzed. A single line, Sparrow, roof of St. Agnes parking garage, 1 p.m. Don't bring questions you can't stomach the answers to. I almost laughed. Sparrow. Of course Elias would have a contact with a code name lifted from a Cold War thriller. I pocketed the phone, crumpled the cookie bag, and walked back into the city's noise. The garage roof stank of hot tar and pigeons. At one sharp, a man leaned against the railing, smoking a cigarette down to the filter. He wore a battered bomber jacket with no insignia and mirrored sunglasses that reflected only sky. You Maya, he asked, not moving. Yes. Good. Elias says you see ghosts in numbers. I see ghosts in paperwork. That makes us cousins. He dropped the cigarette and ground it out. Name's not Sparrow, but you'll never know the real one, so Sparrow it is. He handed me a thin envelope. Inside were copies of insurance claims, ships lost to storms on nights when NOAA reported calm seas, claims approved, payouts wired, signatures from Halcyon's risk division, At the bottom of each, initials in neat cursive, BC, Benito Cruz, I whispered. Sparrow nodded. He signed off on half the fake claims. Not stupid, not sloppy, but scared. They hold something over him. Family, maybe. If we pull him in, he cracks the wall. If not, he's the wall itself. The envelope shook in my hands. Why give this to me? Because you're already on their kill list, Sparrow said simply. One more target won't change the odds, and because Elias thinks you're the only one stubborn enough to drag Benito into daylight. He pushed off the railing, started toward the stairwell, then looked back. Oh, and don't answer, Ethan. Not yet. Love's a leash in their world. Cut it before they tug. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the rook heavy in my pocket, Sparrow's envelope spread across the wood. Each page smelled faintly of smoke, like the ghosts of ships that had never sunk. Benito's initials stared at me, neat and damning. I wanted to text Ethan, to ask if he knew, if he was part of this. Instead, I dialed Priya's number on the flip. She answered with no hello. You found something, didn't you? More than something, I said. I found a chute, and I found Benito. Silence stretched then. Then you'd better be ready, Maya, because once we pull that thread, everything unravels. I looked at the rook, its scratched coordinates glinting under my lamp. The board was tilting faster now, and I was already moving pieces I couldn't take back. The next day began with rain, thin, cold needles slashing sideways against the glass. I carried Sparrow's envelope inside my coat, as if paper could shiver. The city felt sharper, suspicious, like every cab mirror was turned toward me. I went to the library again, third floor, back table. The flip buzzed just as I sat down. Meet tonight, same park, bring nothing but your eyes. I closed the message and opened the screenshots of sweep.h. Every line of code was a confession written in bash. Locate, copy, vanish. The existence of that script meant Halcyon didn't just delete my memo, they collected it. They curated their sins. Luxembourg was the vault. At noon, I ducked into a diner with steamed windows and the smell of burnt toast. I ordered coffee I didn't want, spread Benito's insurance claims on the table, and traced his initials with my finger. Over and over, neat as a signature on a death warrant. If Sparrow was right, Benito was the wall, and walls could either shelter you or trap you. At 7:05, I found Priya on the same bench in Fort Greene. Her beanie was gone. Rain had flattened her hair against her cheeks. Show me, she said. I passed her the screenshots of sweep.sh on a wiped thumb drive. She scrolled fast, her lips moving silently. Then she exhaled, hard. Son of a... They built themselves a memory hole with a souvenir drawer. That's not sloppiness, that's design. Her eyes flicked to me. This is enough to bury careers, maybe even send subpoenas flying. Then why do I feel like it's still not enough, I asked. Because it isn't. She snapped the drive shut. Executives don't fall over code alone. They'll call it rogue ops, a junior tech gone wild. To aim higher, we need a human, someone inside their circle. Benito fits. I thought of his initials, the tidy BC. If we corner him, won't they just crush him first? They might, she said flatly, but if he talks, he's our lever, and levers move mountains. That night I couldn't sleep. The ceiling felt too low, the shadows too long. I opened Ethan's unsent message again. Can we talk? The words looked harmless, almost tender, but I heard Sparrow's warning. Love is a leash. If I reached back, was I asking to be pulled into the pit? I locked the phone in my desk drawer. Instead, I pulled out Elias's rook, setting it in the lamplight. The brass gleamed dull gold, the scratches like scars. For the first time I realized, rooks don't move diagonally. They move straight, relentless, until they hit something that can't move. Maybe that was what Elias wanted me to understand. I whispered to the empty room, then straight it is. 2 days later, Sparrow arranged it. Benito Cruz, Midtown, lunch hour crowd as cover, a narrow cafe with walls the color of rust. He looked smaller than I remembered from old compliance calls. Dark circles under his eyes, hands trembling as he stirred a coffee he never drank. When he saw me, his jaw tightened. Maya, you shouldn't be here. Neither should you, I said. I slid one of the forged insurance claims across the table. Your initials. His knuckles went white on the spoon. You don't understand. Then explain it. For a long time, all I could hear was the hiss of milk steaming. Then he whispered, They said my sister would die if I didn't sign. They sent photos, hospital bed, oxygen tubes, said her bills would vanish if I cooperated, said if I didn't, she would vanish instead. My throat burned. So you signed. He nodded, eyes wet. Every time. I thought maybe if I kept quiet, if I did what they asked, I could keep her safe. But safety doesn't exist with men like them. They take and take until you're a ghost. He looked up at me, desperate. What are you going to do with this? The rook in my pocket felt like an anchor. Tell the truth, I said. Benito's laugh was hollow. Truth is dangerous currency. Spend it wrong and it kills you. Then help me spend it right, I said. He stared at me, then at the paper between us, then back. Finally he nodded once, sharp as a knife's point. I'll talk, he said, but not here, not on their board, somewhere they don't own. And just like that, the wall cracked. Benito chose the place himself, an underground parking garage near Queens Boulevard, midnight sharp. He said it was the only place he trusted, too exposed for surveillance vans to hide, too empty for casual eyes. I arrived early, the rook heavy in my pocket, the flip phone turned off but close. The air smelled of damp concrete and oil. Every step echoed like a warning. Benito emerged from the shadows 15 minutes late, his collar up, his breath white in the cold. He clutched a battered leather satchel as if it were a life vest. This is everything I kept, he whispered, opening it with shaking hands. Inside were photocopies, USB drives, even a handful of handwritten notes. Insurance claims, correspondence, doctored manifests, every one of them signed or routed through his name. They made me their pen, he said bitterly, but I copied everything, in case I needed to prove I wasn't the monster they painted me to be. I reached out, careful, reverent. This could take them down, Benito. This is proof. He grabbed my wrist before I could pull the satchel away. His grip was surprisingly strong. No, Maya, this isn't proof yet. It's just paper. They'll call it forged, fabricated, stolen. To nail them, you need context. Logs, access histories, signatures that can't be denied. Greyhound, I said. His eyes widened. You know about that? Priya told me. He shook his head, almost panicked. If you touch Greyhound, you won't just be exposing them. You'll be painting a target on your forehead. It's their playground, their sandbox for hiding ghosts, but it's also where the bodies are buried. I closed the satchel and pulled it against my chest. Then show me how to dig. For a long moment he searched my face, as if deciding whether I was savior or executioner. Finally, he let go of my wrist. Fine, he said, but once you go in, there's no coming back. Greyhound doesn't forgive trespassers. It erases them. Back at my apartment, I hid the satchel under a loose floorboard beneath my bed. My hands trembled as I pressed the wood back into place. I couldn't shake Benito's eyes, the look of a man already half buried, begging not for rescue but for someone to drag his story into daylight before the dirt closed over him completely. The flip buzzed. A new message from an unknown number, postcard received. Octopus smiled. We should talk. Same library tomorrow, noon. 3rd floor, back table. I didn't remember breathing as I read it. Elias had told me Lara Wexler was the journalist who played with knives and never flinched. If she was ready to meet, then the game had just shifted. I barely slept that night. Ethan's message still sat unsent in my phone, glowing like a wound every time I closed my eyes. Can we talk? Could I? Would I? At 3 a.m. I walked to the window. The rain had stopped, but the city shimmered with wet reflections, headlights dragging streaks of silver across the black asphalt. Somewhere out there, Ethan was probably asleep in silk sheets, unaware that the foundations of his family's empire were stacked like tinder beneath his feet. Or maybe he knew. Maybe that was why he wanted to talk. I pressed my forehead against the glass and whispered into the dark, If you knew, Ethan, if you knew and stayed silent, you're part of this. The rook lay on my nightstand, its brass edges glinting. I touched it with one finger and thought of Elias's voice. Do you want to wreck a dynasty? I already had my answer. Tomorrow, Lara. Then Greyhound. And after that, war. The library smelled of paper and dust, the way truth always should. I found the table where Elias had first told me to sit and waited. Noon came, and with it, a woman in a weather-beaten coat, hair pulled into a knot, a satchel slung over her shoulder like a weapon. She sat without ceremony, placed a notebook on the table, and spoke before I could. Elias says you're reckless. I say that makes you interesting. Lara Wexler, I asked. She didn't nod, didn't smile. Depends who's asking. If you're another pawn of the Kincaids, then I'm nobody. If you're the woman who dug sweeps out of their graveyard, then I'm your best and last ally. I exhaled. Then yes, I'm her. Her eyes sharpened, a hawk scenting blood. Show me what you've got. I slid a single page from Sparrow's envelope across the wood, the insurance claim with Benito's initials. Lara didn't flinch. She read it once, twice, then tapped the corner. Forgery risk, medium. Legal value, weak. Narrative value. Her eyes lifted, cold fire. Explosive, but only if we can prove it's not an orphan. Do you have more? Yes, I said carefully. Benito gave me copies, and there's Greyhound. The word changed her expression. Her jaw tightened. Greyhound's the Kincaid family's shadow vein. I tried sniffing around it once. 2 days later, my editor got a polite letter from Halcyon's lawyers, and my rent check bounced. I took it as a warning. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. If you're serious about touching Greyhound, you'll need 3 things: an access key, a safe outlet for leaks, and people who won't flinch when lawyers start throwing fire. You have Priya for keys. You have me for outlets. But the people? That's harder. Arthur Sterling, I whispered before I could stop myself. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. You've seen him? I found me. Said he built Halcyon before Gregory stole it. Lara's pen scratched furiously against her notebook. Then the story isn't just fraud, it's betrayal, blood, empire. If Arthur's alive and willing to speak, this becomes more than scandal. It becomes Shakespeare. I clenched my hands to stop them shaking. Scandals can be buried. Dynasties survive them. Not if we stack the bodies in daylight, Lara said. That night, Priya came over. She looked out of place in my cramped apartment, her soaked hoodie dripping onto the floor, her face pale but determined. I can get you into Greyhound, she said, dropping a flash drive onto the table. But it's not like plugging in and browsing. It's a jungle, a mirror of their darkest secrets. You touch the wrong file, alarms go off. You touch the right one, you'll see things you can't unsee. I picked up the drive. It was warm from her pocket, light as a match. What's the right one? She smirked faintly. That's the fun part. We won't know until it tries to kill us. At 2 a.m., when the city was quieter than it ever allowed itself to be, I powered up the drive. Priya had built me a sandbox, an isolated environment where Greyhound's mirror could be mounted without leaving fingerprints. The directory tree unfolded slowly, line by line like the opening of a forbidden book. Folders named in plain, bland words: clients, roots, partners, claims. But under claims was a subfolder, tagged only with a single letter, G. I clicked. Inside were files stamped with years stretching back 2 decades. Each file was a ledger of payouts: ships that never sailed, storms that never raged, cargo that never existed. Billions, siphoned through shells and rebranded as insurance cleanups. Each entry carried an authorizing signature: Gregory Sterling, Roy Sterling, Bill Sterling, and sometimes Ethan Kincaid. My breath left me in a shudder. I stared at his name, written in neat blue ink on a scanned PDF, the same hand that once held mine in a stairwell, promising a future. Priya leaned over my shoulder. Her eyes darted, then froze. Maya, this isn't just fraud. This is organized theft at a scale that can topple governments. If Ethan's in here. He knew, I said, my voice hollow. He knew, and he let me burn. For a moment the room seemed to tilt, the rook in my pocket anchoring me only barely. The man I loved was carved into the very rot I'd sworn to expose. Do we pull it? Priya asked, her hand hovering over the keyboard. Yes, I whispered, though my heart cracked with every letter. Pull everything. As the files copied, I whispered to myself, love is a leash, and I just cut mine. The files finished copying at 3:27 a.m. The screen went black for a beat, then flickered, like Greyhound itself had noticed the theft. Priya yanked the cable with a curse, killing the session. Too long, she muttered, stuffing the drive into a Faraday pouch. They might have logged the handshake. I sat frozen, Ethan's signature still seared into my mind. A neat line of ink, small and damning. He wasn't just a bystander. He was part of the machine. At dawn, the city glowed dull gray. I took the rook from my pocket and set it on the windowsill. For the first time, it didn't feel like a key. It felt like a weight, pressing me toward choices I wasn't ready to make. The flip buzzed. A message from Elias. Meet noon, Pier 14, bring no devices. I went, hands in pockets, rain biting my cheeks. Elias stood where I had first met him, coat buttoned to his throat, eyes sharp despite the weather. You've seen Greyhound, he said. It wasn't a question, I nodded. Gregory, Roy, Bill, and Ethan. His face tightened, the kind of grief only betrayal can carve. I had hoped. He shook his head. No, I knew. The boy was raised in their house. You can't sleep under a leaking roof and not get wet. My throat burned. He was the one who held me when I thought the world was ending, and all along he was signing the papers that buried me. Elias placed a hand on my shoulder, the weight steady. That pain is the steel you'll need. You can't fight dynasties with mercy, only with truth. That evening, Lara called me from a payphone. Her voice was tight, urgent. They know, she said. Sterling PR just blasted an internal memo calling you a disgruntled ex-employee with delusional accusations. I got it from a source inside. They're framing you as unstable. It's the opening salvo. My stomach turned. How fast will it spread? By morning, she said. Blogs, tabloids, maybe even mainstream if they grease the right hands. You need to decide if you're going public before their version hardens into fact. I looked at the rook on my table, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Not yet. We need more. We need Benito's voice. 2 nights later, Benito and I met again, this time in a shuttered laundromat Sparrow had secured. The air smelled of detergent and rust. He paced like a man who had already confessed to ghosts. They'll kill me if I talk, he said, his voice ragged. But if I don't, I'll die slowly anyway. You won't be alone, I promised. We'll protect you. His laugh was broken glass. No one protects against the Kincaids, but maybe if I put my face to it, someone will believe. He handed me a recorder. My statement, names, dates, transactions, keep it safe. The device was small, silver, unremarkable, but it felt heavier than a gun. When I left the laundromat, the streets were empty, slick with rain. I pulled my hood tight and walked fast. Halfway home, a car rolled slowly behind me, headlights dim, engine purring like a predator. I turned down an alley. The car didn't follow, but I knew. They were watching now. I clutched the recorder in my pocket, heart hammering. For the first time since this began, I understood what Elias meant when he said, "Only by exposing him can your family have a future." The dynasty had seen me, and I had just drawn blood. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the radiator felt like a warning. I kept the recorder clutched in my hand under the blanket, as though the little silver device could shield me from everything coming. At dawn, I slipped it into the hollow behind my stove beside the satchel Benito had given me. Then I left the apartment with the rook in my pocket and the flip phone in 2 pieces, battery in one shoe, shell in the other. By noon, I was sitting across from Lara at a corner booth in a Chinatown noodle shop, steam fogging the windows, bowls clattering around us. She leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Benito's statement changes everything," she said, tapping her notebook. "A human voice, a confession. This isn't just paper trails anymore, it's blood." I slid the recorder across the table. His voice, names, dates, everything. She picked it up reverently, like a relic. "We publish this, Maya, and the Kincaids won't just try to smear you. They'll come for your life." I swallowed hard. "They already are." She nodded once, as if that answer sealed a contract. "Then we hit first. I'll start drafting a series. 1 article to test the waters, to get the public sniffing. We don't drop Greyhound yet. Not until we have a way to shield it. But Benito's voice? That's enough to light a fire." That evening, Priya and I met in a disused subway station where the tracks were rusted and the walls still carried faded ads from the 90s. Her laptop glowed like a forbidden lantern in the dark. She showed me an access log she'd pulled from Greyhound. One line highlighted in red, "User, E-Kincaid, approved payout, claim ID 4872, vessel Calypso 47,000. My chest tightened. Ethan's name, again. Priya glanced at me, her voice softer than usual. "You can still back out, Maya. No one would blame you." I shook my head. "He burned me. He signed their lies. If I walk now, I'm just another ghost in their file cabinet." She closed the laptop gently. "Then be ready, because once Lara runs Benito's voice, the Kincaids will realize the walls are cracking, and cornered animals don't retreat, they bite." The article dropped 3 days later. Whistleblower claims Sterling Empire manipulated maritime insurance. I was forced to sign or my family would suffer. Benito's words echoed in black and white, his trembling voice transcribed with brutal clarity. Names were named, figures were listed, and though Lara kept Greyhound out of it, she included one telling line. Independent sources confirm that internal backups suggest a systemic pattern. By evening, the story was everywhere. Financial blogs, social media threads, even the ticker crawling across Times Square, Sterling under fire. My phone, my real phone, not the flip, exploded with messages. Old colleagues, relatives, even strangers digging my email out of the ether. Some called me brave, others called me a liar. And then at 11:42 p.m., a text from Ethan. "Ethan, why are you doing this? You don't know the whole story." I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. My fingers hovered over the keys. For a heartbeat, I wanted to believe him, to imagine some explanation that would erase his name from those ledgers. But the rook on my nightstand caught the glow of the screen, brass shining like judgment. I didn't reply. At 2 a.m., someone knocked on my door. Not the friendly knock of a neighbor. 3 heavy raps, deliberate. I froze, breath caught in my throat. Another knock, louder, then silence. When I finally found the courage to look through the peephole, the hallway was empty, only a single envelope lying on the floor. I picked it up with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in cold, perfect letters. "Stop now or your son will grow up without you." My knees almost gave. I didn't have a son, not yet, but they knew about my pregnancy. The rook felt like ice when I clutched it. For the first time, fear wasn't just about me, it was about the life I carried. And fear, I realized, could be sharper than any blade. I sat on the floor for what felt like hours. The letter crumpled in my fist, the rook digging into my palm until my skin turned white. They knew. Somehow they knew. Not just about me, but about the child I hadn't told anyone about. Not Priya, not Lara, not even my mother. The Kincaids had eyes everywhere. When I finally stood, I tore the letter into strips and flushed them piece by piece down the toilet, but the words were already carved into my skull. "Stop now, or your son will grow up without you." I wasn't sure if the threat was prophecy or promise. The next day I met Lara at a riverside bench, seagulls screaming above the current. She studied my face before I spoke. "They know," I whispered. Her eyes narrowed. "How?" I shook my head. "Doesn't matter, they know, and they'll use it." She tapped her pen against her notebook, each click like a gavel. "Then we don't retreat. We double down. Fear only works if you let it silence you. We turn their threat into evidence, proof of intimidation." But my voice cracked when I answered. "It's not just me anymore, Lara. If they touch my child," her hand closed over mine, firm, grounding, "then we burn them faster. You think you're alone in this? You're not. Elias, Priya, Benito, me, we're already committed. Dynasties don't fall quietly, but they do fall." That evening, Priya slipped me a burner laptop wrapped in duct tape. "Greyhound's bleeding," she said. "They patched the hole we used, but not before I cloned a fragment, logs, enough to link payouts to Ethan's account directly. If this leaks, he's finished." My heart twisted. Ethan's name again, Ethan's signature, Ethan's silence. I forced myself to look Priya in the eye. "Then we leak it." She hesitated. "Maya, are you ready for what that means? Once Ethan's exposed, there's no going back. Not for you, not for him." I thought of his last text. "You don't know the whole story. Maybe he was right. Maybe there was a story behind the signatures, a chain of coercion like Benito's. Or maybe he'd chosen the dynasty over me long ago. Either way, truth doesn't wait for permission." "Do it," I said. 2 days later, Lara published her follow-up. "Greyhound leaks. Internal logs tie Sterling heirs to fraudulent maritime claims." The article showed Ethan's name in cold print alongside Roy's and Bill's, screenshots of ledger entries, cross-references to Benito's testimony. Enough evidence to shift the scandal from rumor to reckoning. The reaction was instant. Markets shuddered. Sterling Group's stock price plummeted overnight. News anchors spoke my name with equal parts awe and venom. And at 3 a.m., my phone lit up with a call from Ethan. I stared at it, frozen. The screen glowed like a wound that wouldn't close. On the 4th ring, I answered. "Maya," his voice broke through the static, ragged, desperate. "Please, you don't understand. They forced me, just like Benito. If I didn't sign, if I didn't play along, they said they'd bury you. You and the baby." The room tilted around me. My grip tightened on the rook until the brass edge cut into my palm. "Then why?" I whispered. "Did you let them burn me alive while you stayed silent?" Silence. Just his breath, shallow, broken. And in that silence I understood. Whether he was victim or villain, the truth had already chosen him. The dynasty was cracking, and Ethan Kincaid was about to be crushed under the weight of his own name. The days after Ethan's name hit the headlines felt like living inside a storm. News vans parked outside Sterling's Manhattan Tower. Commentators debated whether the dynasty could survive. Social feeds split between fury and sympathy. Some called Ethan a pawn, others a traitor. I stayed inside, curtains drawn, rook on the table like a compass pointing to war. The letter's threat haunted me with every heartbeat. Your son will grow up without you. On the fifth night, Sparrow appeared at my door without knocking. He smelled of smoke and rain, his jacket streaked with ash. "They're moving faster than I thought," he said. "Gregory's cutting ties, laundering what's left. Roy's already on a jet to Zurich. Bill's hiding in the Hamptons. Ethan," he paused. "Ethan's under house guard. They don't trust him anymore." My stomach lurched. "House guard? You mean prison?" "Prison with marble floors," Sparrow muttered. "But prison all the same. If they think he'll flip, they'll cage him until they decide whether to keep him or erase him." The words hung heavy. Erase him. 2 mornings later, Lara called from a burner. Her voice trembled with something I'd never heard from her before. Fear. "Benito's gone," she said. My throat closed. "What do you mean, gone?" "Hospital fire, supposedly electrical. He was inside, his sister too." The room spun. Benito's trembling hands, his cracked laugh, his recorder, all gone in smoke. "They silenced him," Lara whispered. "The article gave him a voice, so they took it away." I pressed the rook so hard into my palm I thought it might shatter. "Then we don't stop. We scream louder." That night, I met Elias on the pier again. The river was black glass, reflecting only fragments of light. He looked older than before, shoulders bowed under decades of betrayal. "They're killing witnesses," I said. "One by one, Benito today, tomorrow, me." Elias shook his head slowly. "Not tomorrow, not if you move first. Benito knew this was coming. That's why he gave you the recorder. His voice lives as long as you protect it." I stared out at the river, its endless pull. "And Ethan?" "Ethan has to choose," Elias said quietly. "Dynasty or redemption. But redemption costs more than most heirs are willing to pay." 3 nights later, I got another envelope under my door. No words this time, just a single photograph. Ethan, through the bars of a gated estate, his face bruised, eyes hollow. On the back, in the same cold type, one move and he disappears. My breath caught, my hands shook. For the first time since this war began, I felt torn clean in half. Because if the dynasty wanted me silenced, Ethan had become their bait. And love, even poisoned, even betrayed, was still a chain I couldn't cut free of without bleeding. I didn't leave my apartment for 24 hours after that photograph arrived. I sat at the table with the rook in one hand and the picture in the other, staring at Ethan's bruised face until the two blurred together. Was he the man who signed those claims? Or the boy who once held me in a stairwell and whispered that the world couldn't touch us? Maybe both. Maybe neither. The dynasty had turned him into bait, and me into the one who had to decide if he was worth saving. At dusk, Priya stormed in without knocking. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hoodie damp with rain. "They're tightening the net," she said. "I intercepted chatter. Sterling's legal team has drafted an injunction. They're going to gag every outlet Lara works with. If it sticks, the stories vanish by morning." "Then we publish everything now," I said. Her head snapped toward me. "Maya, if we dump Greyhound raw, they'll bury you under lawsuits before the ink dries. It's suicide." I set Ethan's photo on the table. "They're already burying people. Benito, his sister. Who's next? You? Me? My child? We don't have the luxury of patience anymore." For once, Priya didn't argue. She looked at the rook gleaming in the dim light and whispered, "Then we go for checkmate." Lara agreed to meet that night in a safe house above a shuttered bookstore. The walls smelled of mold and old ink, and the only light came from a single desk lamp. She listened as I laid out the plan, release Benito's recorder in full, leak the Greyhound ledgers, and tie it all together with Elias's testimony. No more half measures. When I finished, Lara closed her notebook with a decisive snap. "It'll destroy them, but it'll destroy you too." I swallowed hard. "Maybe, but at least it won't destroy the truth." At midnight, the flip buzzed. A new message. No number attached. "They're watching me, but if you still believe I'm not them, meet me. One last time." 3 a.m. Battery Park. Rook. I stared at the screen until my pulse drowned out the city noise. He'd used the word, Rook, Elias's word. My word. It could be a trap. It probably was. But if it wasn't, If there was still a piece of Ethan not carved out by the dynasty, then walking away meant letting that piece die unseen. Priya grabbed my arm. "Don't go. If it's real, he should come to us." I shook my head, pocketed the rook, and whispered, "Some truths you can't wait to have delivered. You have to walk into the dark and take them." At 3 a.m., Battery Park was almost empty, only the river whispering against the stones. I stood under the skeletal trees, the rook heavy in my pocket, every nerve braced. And then he stepped from the shadows, Ethan, thinner, bruised, eyes ringed with exhaustion. He looked at me like a man already halfway gone. "Maya," he rasped, "I can end this, but you'll hate me for what it costs." The rook burned against my skin. "Then say it," I whispered. "Show me the truth before the dynasty takes it with you." Ethan's hands shook as he pulled a folded sheaf of papers from his coat. They were water-stained, edges frayed, but the signatures were clear. Gregory's, Roy's, Bill's, and his own. "These are the master authorizations," he said hoarsely. "Greyhound's route ledger. Every fraudulent payout routes through here. Without it, the rest is circumstantial. With it," he looked at me, eyes hollow, "with it, the dynasty burns." I stared at him, unable to breathe. "Why now?" "Because they've turned on me," he said, voice breaking. "I thought I could survive inside, play their game long enough to shield you. But when Benito spoke, when Lara published, they decided I was expendable, and I realized I'd been lying to myself. I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting them." His words cut deeper than any threat ever had. I reached into my pocket, fingers curling around the rook. "Then tell me, Ethan, were you ever on my side?" He flinched, as if the question itself was a blade. "Always, but I was too weak to prove it." We met Elias in the gray dawn on the pier. The river smelled of iron and rain. When Ethan handed him the ledger, Elias's face hardened, grief and vindication mingling in his eyes. "This," Elias said, holding the papers like scripture, "is the heart of the beast. With Benito's recorder, Priya's logs, Lara's pen, we finally have enough. Gregory won't survive this." Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. "Neither will I." Elias studied him for a long moment. "Maybe not, but you can choose how you fall. As a sterling, or as a man who finally chose the truth." The release happened 2 days later. Lara published everything in one sweeping expose. The route ledger, Benito's voice, Greyhound's logs, Arthur Sterling's testimony. Headlines screamed across every screen, "The fall of a dynasty. Inside the Sterling Empire's decades of fraud." Gregory was indicted within hours. Roy fled to Europe and was intercepted in Frankfurt. Bill vanished into hiding, but the warrants followed. And Ethan turned himself in, walking into the courthouse with the rook in his pocket and my handprint still faint on his sleeve. The cameras captured every second. Some saw him as complicit, others as a traitor to his bloodline. But for me, in that single image, he was just the man who had finally chosen to stand on the side of daylight. Weeks later, I stood in my apartment, curtains open at last. The city moved on below me. Sirens, vendors, laughter, grief. Life refusing to pause, even when dynasties fell. On the windowsill, the rook gleamed, scarred brass catching the morning sun. It was no longer just a key or a weight or a threat. It was a reminder that even pawns can move forward, that even towers can fall, and that the truth, once freed, cannot be silenced again. I placed my hand on my stomach, feeling the faintest kick beneath my skin, and whispered, "You'll grow up in a world where their shadows don't own us anymore." The city roared. The dynasty was ash, and I, finally, was free.